under the blistering heat of a war-torn desert. The forward observation post was a skeleton of sandbags and camouflage netting strung between splintered poles, its operators pinned down by the knowledge of what they were watching unfold beyond the horizon. Intelligence had filtered in through intercepted transmissions that 3 high-ranking enemy generals had converged on a hidden compound carved into the foothills, a location so heavily guarded that most within the Navy SEAL unit had assumed any attempt to neutralize them was tantamount to suicide. 4 hours, the commander, a weathered veteran with scars etched deeper than the creases around his eyes, had studied the terrain, the patrol routes, the sheer number of fortified positions, and each time his judgment had landed on the same conclusion: an assault would be impossible without heavy casualties. But there was someone else crouched among them, steady hands adjusting the long barrel of a custom rifle resting on its bipod, a woman with a reputation so quietly passed around the teams that her name alone was enough to hush conversations. She had no rank to match the brass of generals nor the bark of seasoned officers, yet she carried something that none of them could calculate: an ability to see possibilities where others saw barriers. As the commander whispered under his breath, half in disbelief and half in resignation, "That shot is impossible," she didn't look away from her scope. She didn't correct him, didn't offer bravado, didn't speak at all. Her breath slowed, her heartbeat seemed to vanish into the silence of the desert wind, and all that existed for her was the tiny crosshair fixed on a shaded balcony half a mile away where the first of the generals had stepped into view, convinced that distance and fortifications made him untouchable. She adjusted her elevation, calculated the wind shift, and fired. The crack of the suppressed round barely rippled through the air, but seconds later the general collapsed as though fate itself had plucked him from the earth. No one had time to react before another figure appeared, rushing to investigate. She adjusted slightly, reading the heat waves, the subtle distortion of distance, and again squeezed the trigger. The second general fell before the echo of the first shot had even settled. The compound stirred into chaos, guards shouting orders, scrambling across the courtyard, but the last general, confident in his distance, emerged onto a different balcony, believing no marksman alive could reach him through the shifting wind and blazing light. The commander muttered a prayer, shaking his head, but she didn't falter. For her, the impossible was just a calculation waiting to be solved. She factored in the angle of the sun, the minute arc of gravity over distance, the shimmer of the desert heat, and the breath she was holding. She pressed the trigger once more. The silence stretched thin before the general's body dropped out of sight, his authority erased in an instant. For a long moment the entire SEAL unit stared, as though they had all witnessed something that defied the rules of combat, of physics, even of luck. The commander finally exhaled the disbelief he had been carrying, shaking his head slowly. "That shot was impossible," he repeated, but his voice carried no doubt now, only awe. She allowed herself a single blink, lifted her head from the scope, and without ceremony began breaking down her rifle, piece by piece, as if what she had just done were no more remarkable than breathing. Yet deep down, every man present knew they had just seen history bend around a single bullet, and for the rest of their lives, when they told the story, they would remember the moment the impossible became real through the calm hands of a woman who had never believed in limits. The compound descended into chaos after the last general fell, guards spilling out of bunkers and stairwells, radios squawking in panic as shouts overlapped in confusion, but the woman behind the rifle didn't look back at the men around her or bask in the silent awe radiating from the commander. Her mind was already moving 3 steps ahead. She knew the ripple effect of what she had done. 3 enemy leaders dead in under a minute meant the chain of command had been decapitated, but it also meant that every surviving soldier in that fortress would turn feral, desperate, and unpredictable. The commander whispered into his comms, ordering the unit to hold positions and await further instructions. But even he understood their situation had shifted into something both more dangerous and more advantageous. The woman, methodical and quiet, slipped the rifle back into its case and checked the sidearm at her hip as though her part was finished. Yet a storm was brewing around them that would demand more than perfect shots. Trucks roared to life in the compound below, headlights slicing through the haze as troops scrambled into defensive formations. Mortar crews sprinted to firing platforms, and within seconds the first dull thump echoed across the desert, followed by an explosion of sand 50 meters from their position. The commander cursed under his breath, scanning the horizon. "They're blind firing, they don't know where we are yet," he growled, but he knew it was only a matter of time before luck or sheer saturation forced them to move. She crouched beside him, calm where others twitched with nerves, and her eyes tracked the patterns of movement below with the same detached focus she had given the crosshairs. She wasn't just a sniper, she was a strategist who saw rhythm in chaos, threads of opportunity woven into the noise of battle. "They'll sweep the ridgeline next," she murmured, her first words in hours, and though her tone was soft, the commander nodded without hesitation, repeating the order for the team to reposition before the inevitable search reached them. As they slid down the embankment, the night deepened, stars sharpening against the sky, and the heat of day gave way to a chill that clung to the skin. The unit moved like shadows, their boots whispering across stone, but every man felt the weight of being hunted. The loss of the generals hadn't broken the enemy, it had ignited them into a frenzy of retaliation. From their new vantage point behind jagged rock formations, the SEALs watched as searchlights pierced the desert, beams combing like fingers across the ridgeline they had just vacated. One of the younger operators muttered in disbelief, still riding the shock of what he'd seen earlier. 3 shots and they're headless," he said half to himself, but the commander silenced him with a sharp gesture. This wasn't the time for reverie. The woman meanwhile was already assembling her weapon again, not the long sniper rifle, but a suppressed carbine designed for close-quarters engagements. The commander raised an eyebrow, understanding immediately what she intended. "We're not going into that nest," he whispered, but her look told him otherwise. She wasn't reckless, but she knew the enemy would lock down the compound, scattering outward to hunt ghosts. That chaos was their cover. She slipped the last piece of the carbine into place and checked her sights, her movements practiced, efficient, the kind of motions that suggested countless repetitions in silence and solitude. The commander leaned close, lowering his voice. "You already did the impossible tonight. Don't push it further." For the first time, she looked him directly in the eyes, her gaze steady, unflinching, and what he saw wasn't arrogance or stubbornness but a certainty that unnerved him more than any boast. "The impossible is the only thing they don't expect," she whispered back, and then turned her focus back to the compound below. The SEALs tightened their gear, hearts pounding with the anticipation of what was coming, because whether they wanted it or not, they were about to follow her into the storm. The desert wind carried the faint metallic scent of blood and gunpowder, the echo of the fallen generals lingering in every order shouted by panicked officers below, and as the unit prepared to move under her silent command, each man understood that the night was no longer about survival alone. It was about exploiting a fracture so perfectly timed that history itself might tilt. The descent into the compound was a slow crawl through dust and shadow, every movement measured against the sweep of searchlights and the rhythm of boots pounding across stone walkways below, and though the SEALs were hardened men who had trained in darkness and chaos, they found themselves following the woman's lead without question, drawn into her gravity as she moved with a calmness that defied the madness of what had already unfolded. The air was sharp with tension, filled with the distant echoes of shouted orders in a language most of them didn't understand but could feel through the urgency of tone. She signaled for them to halt beneath the jagged lip of a cliff face, raising 2 fingers before pointing toward the far corner of the compound where a fuel truck idled with its lights still burning. To the commander, the vehicle was just part of the background clutter, but she saw something different. The positioning, the carelessness of guards moving past it, the potential energy locked inside those tanks. Her mind wasn't confined to a single trigger pull, it was a web of outcomes spinning outward. She crouched low, traced an invisible line with her hand, and the men understood her intent instantly. One shot into that truck at the right time and the compound's own assets would turn against them. The commander hesitated, weighing risk against reward, but when he looked back at the ridge they'd abandoned and saw search parties already scaling it, he realized they didn't have the luxury of caution anymore. She adjusted her carbine, waiting until a patrol disappeared around a corner, then ghosted forward with the kind of silence that no training manual could teach. Her boots kissed the ground without sound, her silhouette melting into the geometry of walls and crates. The others followed at a distance, nerves taut, but when she reached the cover of a collapsed wall she raised her weapon and fired once, a single suppressed pop lost in the noise of engines and shouting. A second later, the night split open in a roar of fire as the fuel truck ignited, blooming into a violent flower of flame that swallowed guards and equipment alike. The shockwave rolled through the compound, throwing men off their feet, scattering patrols, and in that instant the SEALs surged forward under the veil of chaos she had conjured. Gunfire erupted, wild and unfocused, enemy troops firing into shadows, convinced an entire assault force had descended on them, but in truth it was only a handful of operators moving with surgical precision through smoke and fire. The woman led them through a breach in the outer wall created by the blast, her weapon steady as she dropped 2 guards before they even understood they were under attack. Inside, the compound's architecture twisted into narrow corridors and open courtyards, each space lit by firelight and muzzle flash, and the sounds of war condensed into screams, bursts of automatic rifles, and the sharp whistle of ricochets off stone. She never hesitated at crossroads, her instincts carrying her unerringly toward the heart of the stronghold, as though she could sense where the lines of command were fraying most. The commander shouted orders, his voice hoarse from the dust and adrenaline, but he found himself falling into the rhythm she set, his authority bending toward her certainty. They moved room to room, clearing barracks, storage depots, offices littered with maps and equipment, and each time an enemy soldier raised a weapon she was faster, more precise, her carbine whispering death with mechanical inevitability. One operator caught himself staring between exchanges of fire, not at the enemies falling but at the way she moved. Her composure, the measured way she reloaded without wasted motion, the way her eyes seemed to scan through walls as if anticipating danger before it manifested. They reached a central hall where enemy officers had attempted to rally a defense, hastily setting up machine gun nests behind overturned tables. The firefight that followed was brutal, bullets chewing through plaster and stone, but when the commander barked for covering fire, she slid into position and delivered shots so exact that every enemy gunner fell before they could unleash devastation. The SEALs surged forward into the silence she carved out for them, and within moments the hall was theirs. The smell of cordite and burned fuel clung to the air, mingling with blood and dust, but even as the team caught their breath, she was already moving toward a staircase that descended deeper underground. "Command posts aren't built on balconies," she muttered, her voice low but firm, and though she spoke to no one in particular, the commander fell in beside her, his jaw tight. He knew she was right. The true nerve center would be buried below, hidden away with whatever intelligence the generals had been guarding. As they descended, the walls narrowed, lit only by flickering bulbs and the dull red glow of emergency lights triggered by the explosion above. The deeper they went, the quieter it became, until the noise of battle was replaced by the hum of generators and the pounding of their own hearts. The woman raised her hand for silence, tilting her head as if listening to vibrations through stone. Then she moved, quick and deliberate, signaling the team into flanking positions around a reinforced steel door at the end of the corridor. She stepped to the front, placed her palm against the cold metal, and whispered so softly the commander barely caught it, "This is where the war changes." In that moment, none of them doubted her because she had already turned the impossible into reality, and whatever lay beyond that door they were ready to face it, not because of orders, not because of training, but because they were following someone who made them believe limits were illusions waiting to be shattered. The steel door loomed at the end of the corridor, thick and reinforced, its bolts sunk deep into the stone as though it guarded not just a room but a secret that could shift the balance of the entire war, and as the SEALs fanned out in silence the woman crouched low, her fingers brushing over the hinges, the grooves in the frame, every detail absorbed into her calculating mind. The commander studied her, torn between the instinct to pull her back and the gnawing awareness that without her, they would already be dead, and when she finally met his eyes she gave a single nod, no words, no theatrics, only the quiet certainty that had defined every impossible choice she had made that night. The breacher stepped forward, charges already in hand, and within moments the team braced as the muffled blast ripped through the hallway, smoke curling into the air. The door shuddered, sagged and then gave way, swinging inward to reveal a chamber unlike anything they had expected. Maps stretched across the walls, marked with red pins and coordinates that spoke of planned offensives spanning continents. Crates stacked against the far wall were stenciled not in enemy language but with markings from Allied supply chains, evidence of betrayal, corruption, the hidden hands feeding the war. At the center of the room stood a bank of servers and communication arrays, humming with data that was worth more than the lives of every man they had just killed. But it wasn't the intelligence that froze them in place, it was the small group of soldiers already inside, elite guards who had been waiting, their weapons raised, eyes cold with the discipline of men who did not break at chaos. The firefight erupted instantly, muzzle flashes lighting the chamber like lightning strikes in a storm. The woman dove left, rolling behind a crate as bullets tore splinters into the air, then rose into a crouch and fired 2 shots, each finding its mark before the enemy could adjust their aim. The SEALs poured in behind her, suppressive fire rattling off steel and stone, but the defenders were entrenched, their positions fortified behind server banks and barricades. The commander barked orders, his voice barely audible over the roar, but it was her movements that set the pace, darting from cover to cover, her carbine stitching precise bursts that carved openings for the others to advance. One enemy soldier lobbed a grenade, the metallic clink against the floor a chilling warning, but she was already moving, sliding across the floor to kick it back into the barricade before the blast swallowed the defenders in their own fire. The room shook, smoke flooding the air, and in that haze she moved like a phantom, her silhouette barely visible, her weapon spitting controlled bursts until the last defender fell. Silence reclaimed the chamber, broken only by the crackle of damaged wiring and the ragged breaths of the team. The commander wiped dust from his face, scanning the wreckage, but before he could speak she was already at the servers, pulling a small device from her kit and plugging it into the primary terminal. Data streamed across her handheld screen, encrypted files unraveling into intelligence that confirmed their worst fears. The generals had not only been orchestrating regional campaigns but had secured support from rogue states, stockpiling weapons that could destabilize entire continents. Her eyes narrowed as she scrolled, absorbing the weight of what they had uncovered, and for the first time that night her voice carried urgency. This isn't just a strike. We've cut the head off but the body's still moving. We need to get this out. The commander approached, his chest still heaving from adrenaline, and glanced at the feed. Can you pull it all? She shook her head, already working. Not all. But enough to prove everything. He stared at her, seeing in her not just the sniper who had defied physics but the one person in the room who seemed to understand the war beyond the battlefield, as if she were playing a game several moves ahead. The team secured the chamber, stacking crates into defensive positions, weapons trained on the corridor as though expecting another wave. Time stretched, every second a reminder that the explosion above and the firefight here had already drawn the attention of every surviving enemy. And then, as if summoned by their thoughts, the pounding of boots echoed from the stairwell. The woman didn't flinch, she pulled the device free, slung it against her chest and turned to the commander. We've got what we need. Now we get out alive. The door frame glowed with the light of flashlights, shadows stretching long as soldiers poured down the stairs. The SEALs opened fire, controlled bursts holding the choke point, but the enemy kept coming, driven by rage and desperation. The commander shouted for fallback, and the team began peeling away in formation, each man covering the other as they retreated deeper into the corridor, dragging with them the intelligence that could reshape the war. The woman moved last, her fire so precise it seemed to bend time, cutting down anyone who dared press forward. They reached a secondary exit, a maintenance tunnel that snaked beneath the compound, narrow and damp, the air stale with neglect. The walls reverberated with distant gunfire, but as they pressed onward, the sound dulled, replaced by the rhythmic splash of boots through shallow water. Every man was exhausted, nerves frayed, but when their eyes landed on her, calm and steady even here, they found the strength to keep moving. At the far end, moonlight spilled through a grate, the desert night waiting beyond, and as they emerged one by one into the open air, the commander felt the weight of survival settle into his bones. He turned back once, watching her climb out last, her rifle slung across her back, her gaze sweeping the horizon as if already anticipating the next move. He realized then that what she had done, the impossible shots, the explosion, the intelligence, was not luck or chance but the manifestation of someone who lived in a space beyond fear, beyond doubt, where every decision was distilled into clarity. As the unit regrouped under the stars, the compound burning in the distance like a pyre, the commander found his voice low and reverent. We came here for 3 generals. We're leaving with a war. She glanced at him, expression unreadable, then turned her eyes back to the horizon, and in that silence every man understood that this was only the beginning. The desert did not forgive, and as the team pressed away from the burning compound with the night stretched wide around them, they knew the true battle had only begun, for the enemy was not broken by the deaths of their generals or the collapse of their command post but inflamed, a wounded beast lashing out with every soldier it could muster, and soon the horizon lit with the headlights of armored trucks cresting dunes, engines snarling like predators on the hunt. The woman adjusted the strap of the device still slung against her chest, its weight reminding them all why survival was non-negotiable, and without waiting for orders she shifted their course, guiding them not toward the extraction zone they had planned but deeper into the wilderness, where jagged ravines split the earth and dunes swallowed sound. The commander clenched his jaw but followed without protest, because by now he had learned that when she moved with reason beyond what his maps and briefings could account for. The SEALs trudged in silence, every footfall measured, but the rumble of pursuit grew louder, dust clouds rising behind them as the enemy fanned out in search formations. They could not outrun vehicles, not with the gear they carried and the terrain against them, so the woman led them into a canyon whose walls climbed high enough to choke the moonlight, their bodies swallowed in shadow. The ground narrowed into a riverbed long since dried, and she motioned for silence, her eyes scanning the upper ridges where enemy silhouettes flickered against the stars. The commander tapped her shoulder, whispering with the edge of desperation, "We're boxed in." But she only shook her head, crouching to run her fingers across the stone floor, as if feeling the earth itself for answers, then gestured toward an outcropping where the canyon twisted sharply. They moved, pressing into position, weapons raised, and moments later the first convoy of enemy trucks rolled overhead, engines reverberating through the canyon walls. The woman raised her carbine, sighting not at the soldiers but at the rocks above, and with a single precise burst she struck a cluster of weak stone. The cliffside groaned, then cascaded downward in a thunderous landslide, boulders smashing into the lead vehicle, flipping it onto its side and blocking the others in a violent barricade. Screams echoed, metal crunched, and in the confusion the SEALs opened fire, ambushing the convoy from below with a rain of controlled bursts. The canyon became a killing ground, enemy soldiers scrambling in panic as their advantage dissolved into chaos. The woman never wasted a shot, her bullets finding commanders shouting orders, machine gunners scrambling for position, drivers fumbling in terror. The commander fought beside her, adrenaline scorching through his veins, and for a moment he realized the impossible was happening again. They were turning a certain death trap into an escape. But victory was never complete in war. From the rear of the convoy, reinforcements poured in, heavier armored units that did not break so easily, their guns swiveling downward to unleash a storm of fire that tore chunks from the canyon walls. The SEALs scattered, hugging stone for cover as tracers stitched the air. The commander barked for retreat, but the woman stood her ground, eyes fixed on the far ridge where a mortar team was setting up, their tubes angled directly at the canyon floor. She sprinted forward, weaving between bursts of fire, her movements too fast, too precise for even seasoned soldiers to track, and with 3 sharp shots she silenced the mortar crew before they could drop their first round. Her team covered her return, bullets snapping against rock, but when she slid back into formation her expression hadn't changed, calm, unreadable, as if she had merely adjusted the rhythm of a game she had been playing all along. The commander looked at her, breathing hard, and muttered, "You've bought us time, but they'll come again." She nodded once, pulling a fresh magazine from her vest. "Then we keep moving. Distance is survival." The canyon twisted further into darkness, the team navigating blind, guided only by her instincts as the sound of engines and shouting faded into the distance behind them. Hours seemed to stretch like years, their bodies battered by fatigue and thirst, but the thought of what they carried, the evidence, the intelligence that could unravel alliances and expose traitors, drove them onward. When they finally emerged into the open desert again, dawn was bleeding across the horizon, painting the dunes in blood and gold, and for the first time since the compound they could breathe without the immediate shadow of gunfire. But relief was a fragile illusion. As the first rays of light swept over the sand, a distant thrum reached their ears, low and steady, growing louder with every passing second until it became unmistakable, the sound of helicopter blades cutting through the morning air. The commander raised his binoculars, his jaw tightening as 2 enemy gunships appeared against the rising sun, their silhouettes monstrous, their searchlights already probing the desert floor. Exhaustion sank into the team like lead, but the woman's voice cut through the despair, steady as ever. "They'll sweep the flats first. We move to the dunes." She pointed toward the shifting waves of sand where cover was scarce but concealment possible, and without hesitation the SEALs followed her, diving into the undulating terrain as the gunships prowled above. The sand clung to their skin, their weapons, their lungs, but it shielded them just enough to keep the searchlights from catching their reflections. The commander crawled beside her, whispering fiercely, "We can't outrun those birds." Her eyes narrowed, calculating, and then she pointed toward a jagged plateau rising in the distance, its cliffs sheer and unforgiving. "We don't outrun them. We outthink them." And though his gut twisted at the thought, the commander gave the order because in the end, survival had become synonymous with her judgment. They pressed on toward the cliffs, every muscle screaming, every breath a battle, and behind them the desert awoke with engines, shouts, and gunfire, the enemy unwilling to let the ghosts who had killed their leaders vanish into sand and sun. The plateau loomed ahead like the jagged spine of some ancient beast, its cliffs sheer and cracked, the kind of terrain that punished every step, and as the SEALs hauled themselves up the incline with sand sliding beneath their boots, the thrum of helicopter blades grew louder, beating against the morning sky with relentless pursuit. The woman climbed without hesitation, her movements efficient, pulling herself upward as though the stone itself bent to her will, and the commander found himself watching her with something bordering on disbelief, how she seemed immune to fatigue, how every muscle in her body moved with purpose while his men, hardened though they were, dragged themselves like shadows of soldiers. The gunships circled lower, their rotors whipping up clouds of sand, searchlights raking across the desert floor and then angling upward toward the cliffs where the team scrambled for cover. The first burst of fire came in a storm, tracers stitching across the rock face, sparks spraying as stone shattered, and the commander roared for his men to keep climbing, his throat raw with dust. The woman paused midway, slinging her rifle around and sighting upward, her eye narrowing behind the scope. The helicopter banked, bringing its side-mounted gun to bear, but before it could unleash another salvo she fired, the round piercing the glass canopy with surgical precision. The gunship lurched violently, smoke trailing as it spiraled away, slamming into the desert with an explosion that rippled through the ground beneath them. The team erupted in cheers, but she didn't look back, didn't acknowledge victory, only turned her sights to the second helicopter that now angled sharply, enraged, circling like a hawk over prey. They reached the top of the plateau, bodies battered, lungs searing, and spread out across the flat expanse, weapons raised toward the circling predator. The commander barked for a Stinger missile, but their packs held only rifles and grenades. Heavy ordnance wasn't part of this mission. "We're sitting ducks," one operator hissed, panic lacing his tone, but the woman remained still, her gaze tracking the helicopter's movements, reading its pattern like she had read the wind before her impossible shots. She dropped low, sprinted across the plateau to a cluster of boulders, and braced her rifle against the stone, waiting, until the gunship banked low for its strafing run. She exhaled, squeezed the trigger, and the shot tore through the tail rotor. The helicopter spun wildly, its pilot fighting for control, before crashing into the far side of the plateau in a fiery detonation that sent shockwaves rolling across the stone. Silence followed, broken only by the crackle of flames and the ragged breathing of men who had stared into certain death and survived by the precision of one woman. The commander staggered to her side, his face drawn with exhaustion but his eyes alive with something like reverence. "You just turned us from prey to predators," he rasped, but she only reloaded, her expression unchanged. For her, survival was never glory, it was necessity. Yet even as the team caught their breath, the horizon betrayed them again. Dust clouds swelled in the distance, not one or two but dozens, the enemy's ground forces pushing relentlessly toward the plateau. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and burdened by intelligence that made them targets too valuable to let slip away. The commander scanned the terrain, his mind racing, until he spotted a narrow crevice on the far side of the plateau, a fissure that dropped steeply into a canyon winding west. He pointed, shouting for the team to move, and they rallied, sprinting across the flat expanse as the rumble of engines closed in behind them. The fissure was treacherous, its descent steep and jagged, but it offered the only path away from encirclement, and one by one the seals slid and climbed their way down, rocks breaking loose under their boots. She was the last to descend, pausing to scan the ridge where enemy vehicles now appeared in force, soldiers dismounting, weapons glinting in the morning light. She fired a final burst, cutting down the lead officer, then vanished into the canyon below. The descent carried them into darkness, the canyon walls rising high above, the sun a thin sliver of light, and for a brief moment the chaos above seemed distant, muffled by stone. But the reprieve was fragile. The canyon twisted sharply, revealing a riverbed still slick with water from recent rains, and the mud clung to their boots, slowing them, sucking at their strength. The commander cursed, pushing his men onward, but fatigue was an enemy more insidious than bullets, gnawing at every limb, every thought. And yet she pressed forward without faltering, turning at forks in the canyon with the same certainty she had shown all night, as if she carried a map burned into her mind. Hours blurred, the team moving in silence save for the scrape of boots and the clatter of gear, until at last the canyon opened into a wide basin where the wreckage of an old aircraft lay half buried in sand, its fuselage twisted but intact enough to offer shelter. They collapsed inside, weapons pointed outward, every man sinking into exhaustion while she remained at the entrance, eyes scanning the basin, her carbine resting across her knees. The commander approached, dropping heavily beside her, sweat carving lines through the dust on his face. "We can't keep running forever," he admitted, his voice hoarse. She didn't look at him, only adjusted the device strapped against her chest, its screen flickering with stolen intelligence. "We don't need forever," she said softly. "We need until nightfall. That's when extraction comes." His head snapped toward her, disbelief sparking. "Extraction? Our comms are dead, our birds gone, no one knows where we are." Finally she looked at him, her gaze unwavering. "I sent the signal before we breached the command post." He stared, realization dawning. She hadn't just been killing generals or gathering intel, she had been orchestrating the escape before the mission had even begun, thinking 3 moves ahead while the rest of them fought to keep up. For a long moment he was silent, then let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "You're either the luckiest soldier alive or something else entirely." She didn't answer, only turned her eyes back to the horizon, where the sun dipped lower, and in her silence the commander felt both humbled and unsettled. The team dozed in shifts, nerves stretched thin, every sound in the canyon amplified by exhaustion, but when dusk finally draped its veil across the sky, the distant rumble of aircraft engines returned, not enemy this time but allied. The commander rose, signaling the men to prepare, hope flaring for the first time since the compound, and the woman stood beside him, silent as always, her gaze fixed on the darkening horizon where their salvation approached. The sound of approaching aircraft engines stirred every man in the wreckage from the edge of exhaustion into sharp, desperate alertness, their bodies snapping upright, rifles checked, eyes searching the darkening sky for the familiar outlines of salvation, and when the first shadow of a tilt-rotor transport appeared against the fading sunset, the commander's chest tightened with relief so profound it hurt, yet beneath that relief a seed of unease took root because in war nothing ever arrived without a cost. The woman stood slightly apart from the others, her figure rigid against the glow of the horizon, and though her face betrayed nothing, the commander sensed she was listening for more than just the thrum of rotors. She was weighing the rhythm, the formation, the small inconsistencies that no tired soldier should have noticed, but she did. As the aircraft dipped lower, searchlights cutting arcs across the basin, she murmured under her breath, words the commander barely caught. "Too fast. Too soon." Before he could question her, the transport flared its landing lights, dust exploding into the air as it descended toward the open stretch of sand where they had lit a signal flare, and over the roar of engines the crackle of a friendly voice came through their battered comms for the first time in hours, calling their unit name, demanding confirmation. The younger operators nearly wept with relief, shouting back, but the woman remained silent, her rifle raised, scope locked on the aircraft's markings. Something was wrong and she knew it before the commander did. The paint scheme was slightly off, the tail numbers blurred with dust not from battle but intentional concealment, and as the ramp began to lower, her voice cut through the chaos, sharp and steady, "Back. It's not ours." Her warning came just as the first burst of gunfire erupted from the ramp, a line of tracer rounds cutting across the basin, tearing into the sand where the SEALs had been standing seconds earlier. Chaos exploded, men diving for cover behind the wreckage of the old aircraft, bullets sparking against metal, the false rescue descending into an ambush. The commander cursed, realization striking with the weight of betrayal. Someone had intercepted their signal, maybe even someone on their own side who had chosen profit over loyalty, feeding their coordinates to mercenaries or worse. The woman returned fire instantly, her carbine snapping controlled bursts into the silhouettes pouring down the ramp, each shot finding flesh, buying the team precious seconds to reposition. The transport's guns hammered the basin, dust and stone erupting, and in that storm of death the SEALs fought like cornered wolves, their training stripping away fear, leaving only precision and violence. The commander crawled beside the woman, shouting over the roar, "We can't hold this, they'll cut us to pieces." She reloaded calmly, her hands steady, and pointed toward the plateau ridge. "We don't hold. We climb. Higher ground or we're dead." The order went out, and under the cover of her fire the team broke from the wreckage, sprinting toward the jagged incline at the basin's edge. Bullets chased them, striking sparks from stone, cutting down one man who cried out before silence claimed him, but the others pressed on, scrambling up the ridge with adrenaline burning through exhaustion. She was last again, her rifle spitting fire, each pull of the trigger measured, slowing the enemy advance with a wall of precision that felt impossible for one person alone. When she finally reached the top of the ridge, the team was bloodied, shaken, but alive, and they looked back to see the transport lifting slightly, repositioning for another assault run. The commander grabbed her arm, eyes wide with fury and disbelief. "Who the hell are they? How did they know?" She cut him off with a shake of her head. "Later. Right now we kill that bird or none of us leave." The transport banked, its guns swiveling, and she dropped to a knee, sighting carefully. But even she knew a rifle couldn't bring down armored steel at that distance. The commander swore under his breath, digging through his pack and pulled free one last weapon they had carried as a contingency, a single shoulder-mounted launcher, its warhead a precious commodity they had hoped not to need. He pressed it into her hands without hesitation because if anyone could make the shot, it was her. She steadied the launcher, adjusted for distance and speed, and waited, her body still despite the chaos around her. The gunship roared closer, searchlights flaring, the thunder of its engines rattling stone, and when it was almost upon them, she fired. The missile streaked into the dusk, a line of fire carving across the sky before slamming into the transport's underbelly. The explosion split the air, a blossom of flame consuming the false rescue, its wreckage tumbling into the basin below in a storm of metal and fire. The SEALs erupted in ragged shouts, a mix of triumph and rage, but their victory was tempered by the knowledge that betrayal had stalked them from within their own chain, that their signal had been twisted into a death trap. The woman lowered the launcher, her face unreadable, and for a long moment the only sound was the crackle of burning wreckage below. Then the commander spoke, his voice hoarse but steady. "They'll send more. Whoever sold us out doesn't stop at one ambush." She nodded, slinging her rifle again, and her eyes swept the horizon where darkness thickened into night. "Then we keep moving. There's another extraction but we won't call it. They'll come when we don't." The men stared at her, confusion mixing with faith, but the commander only nodded, because by now he understood her in ways words couldn't explain. She wasn't just surviving the night, she was shaping it, bending it, carving paths through betrayal and chaos with the same precision she brought to every shot. And as they moved once more into the desert, fire at their backs and shadows stretching long before them, each man carried the unshakable certainty that whatever storm still waited, she would find the path through it. No matter how impossible it seemed, the desert night deepened into an abyss of silence, the kind that presses against the eardrums and makes every heartbeat sound like a drum. And as the SEALs trudged onward with blistered feet and hollow stomachs, the weight of what they carried, both the intelligence device and the burden of betrayal, hung heavy on their shoulders, yet it was the woman who bore it with an unshakable stillness, guiding them across dunes and broken ridges with the uncanny instinct of someone who read the land like a map no one else could see. And though the commander longed to question her, to demand answers about who had set them up, about how she could anticipate every twist of fate before it came, he kept his silence, for survival in that moment depended not on explanations but on obedience to her impossible sense of direction. Hours bled together, the horizon shifting only by the crawl of constellations overhead, until at last the faint glimmer of water caught the moonlight in a shallow salt flat, and beyond it rose the jagged skeleton of a half-buried airstrip from a war long past, its cracked runway littered with rusting shells of aircraft that had once ferried soldiers who never came home, and it was here she finally slowed, crouching low, scanning the shadows with a predator's patience. The commander moved to her side, whispering hoarsely, "Why here?" and she simply pointed to the cracked concrete where the faintest shimmer of a thermal beacon pulsed once, invisible to the naked eye but clear through her scope, and understanding dawned on him like a blade to the gut. This was not a planned extraction point, but a contingency so classified even he hadn't been briefed, a place known only to the highest level of command and, somehow, to her. The team huddled into the carcass of an old hangar, its steel ribs groaning in the wind, and waited, each man caught between exhaustion and dread, until the distant growl of engines stirred them awake once more, this time not the predatory whine of hostile helicopters but the lower, heavier thrum of cargo craft approaching low and fast. Still, none dared celebrate, for they had learned bitterly that salvation wore disguises, and the commander gripped his rifle tight, his eyes never leaving the woman who remained utterly calm, as if she alone knew the verdict of this final gamble. The first aircraft banked low, its lights off, its silhouette dark against the stars, and instead of descending immediately it circled, scanning for threats, its discipline too precise for mercenaries or scavengers. This was real, this was theirs, and when at last it dropped toward the strip, its turbines kicking up a storm of dust and salt, the SEALs' bodies sagged with relief so deep it nearly broke them. The ramp fell open, and this time no gunfire erupted, only the urgent shouts of fellow operators beckoning them aboard, and as they staggered up the ramp, one by one collapsing into the safety of steel walls and friendly faces, the commander turned back for the woman, only to see her lingering at the edge of the hangar, her rifle still slung across her chest, her body poised not like someone seeking rescue but like a sentinel weighing whether to step across a line she could not uncross. He shouted over the roar of engines, "Get in!" but her gaze met his with an intensity that cut deeper than any bullet, and in that moment he realized the truth that had been circling him like a shadow since the mission began. She was not one of them, not bound by their command or their flag, but something else entirely, an operative whose allegiance lay in a space so high above his clearance that even asking the question would earn him silence or worse. Yet still she stepped forward, at last climbing the ramp, and when the hatch sealed shut and the aircraft lifted into the night, the men slumped against each other, half asleep, half dead, clutching the device that had cost them so much, while the woman sat apart, her eyes fixed not on them but on the darkness outside, as if her war stretched far beyond the one they had barely survived. Hours later, when the aircraft touched down on a secure base carved into the cliffs of an undisclosed coastline, Command staff swarmed aboard, seizing the device. Checking the wounded, herding the survivors into debriefing chambers lit by sterile white light. The commander tried to speak, to demand answers, to report the betrayal that had nearly killed them, but every attempt was cut short by officers who silenced him with clipped words and colder stares, as though he had stumbled into truths not meant for his rank. The woman, however, was escorted not to debrief but through a separate corridor, flanked by men in suits instead of uniforms, their eyes scanning her with recognition, not suspicion, and as she vanished behind secured doors that sealed with biometric locks, the commander understood that she had not simply saved them, nor merely executed impossible shots. She had been playing a longer game, one whose rules they had never been privy to. Days later, when the SEALs were released back into the world, patched but scarred, commendations whispered but not celebrated, the commander found himself summoned alone into a dim office where a general he had never met leaned across a desk and said without preamble, "The operation never happened. The names of those you lost are already erased from the record. Do you understand?" His fists clenched, rage boiling, but he nodded because he knew resistance would bury him beside his men. Then after a pause the general added, "The woman, forget her. She doesn't exist." And with that, the conversation ended, leaving him with silence heavier than any battlefield. Yet he could not forget, not the calm precision of her rifle, not the impossible instincts that saved them, not the glimmer of something unspoken in her eyes. And though his orders were to bury it all, to erase it from thought and memory, he carried the truth like a hidden scar. That somewhere, in the shadows where wars are born and ended before the world ever learns of them, she was still out there, waiting for the next impossible shot, the next battlefield that no map could mark, the next moment when the line between survival and annihilation balanced on a trigger only she could pull. The end.